It stands as the single greatest act of character assassination in the history of the United States military. For 40 years, the official records of the Pentagon told a specific, damning story about the 24th Infantry Regiment in Korea. The report said they were cowards. The newspapers called it bug-out fever, a racial slur dressed up as a psychological diagnosis, claiming that black soldiers had a genetic predisposition to panic and run away from combat. The Army disbanded them in disgrace, rolled up their colors, and erased their 81-year history as Buffalo Soldiers. They buried the truth under a mountain of paperwork and prejudice. But the graves in Korea tell a different story. The men of the 24th didn't run. They were left to die. They were sacrificed by commanders who would rather lose a battle than prove a black man could fight. This is the story of the Deuce 4, the regiment that was murdered not by the enemy, but by its own country. This is a heavy one. We are about to correct the historical record, and I need to know who is here to witness the truth. This channel is for the people who respect the real history, the hard history. So do me a favor, pause the video right now, go down to the comments and drop your city and state. Let's see where the true patriots are watching from. Represent your hometown, and let's get into the trenches. To understand the tragedy of the 24th Infantry, you have to understand the precipice on which the world stood in the summer of 1950. World War II was over, but peace had not arrived. The Cold War was freezing over, and on the Korean peninsula, the ice was about to break. On June 25th, 1950, the North Korean People's Army, NKPA, backed by Soviet steel and Chinese strategy, surged across the 38th parallel like a tidal wave. This was not a skirmish. It was an invasion. The North Koreans had T-34 tanks, the beasts that had defeated the Nazis at Kursk. They had hardened veterans, and they had momentum. They smashed through the South Korean defenses in days. The United States, caught off guard and complacent from its victory in 1945, scrambled to send help. But the U.S. Army of 1950 was not the juggernaut of 1945. It was hollowed out, understrength, and soft. And it was still segregated. The 24th Infantry Regiment was one of the legendary Buffalo Soldier units, with a lineage dating back to the frontier wars of the 1860s. They had fought in the Spanish-American War. They had fought in the Pacific. They were proud men. But in 1950, they were a unit under siege from within. The Army was technically desegregated by President Truman's order in 1948. But in practice, especially in the occupation forces in Japan, where the 24th was stationed, Jim Crow was still the law of the land. The structure of the regiment was a recipe for disaster designed by racists. The enlisted men were black. The officers, almost exclusively, were white. And these weren't just any white officers. Many of them were men who had performed poorly in other units and were sent to the 24th as a punishment. Or they were Southern traditionalists who actively despised the men they were supposed to lead. There was no trust. There was no bond. There was only a toxic hierarchy of resentment. The white commanders viewed their own troops as lazy, unintelligent, and unreliable. They didn't train them properly because they didn't believe they could be trained. So when the alarm sounded in Japan and the 24th was ordered to deploy to Korea to stop the communist onslaught, they weren't just unprepared. They were being set up to fail. They arrived in Korea in July 1950, thrust into a chaotic, terrifying retreat. The early weeks of the Korean War were a disaster for the entire American military. White units like Task Force Smith were overrun and decimated. Whole divisions were pushed back in panic. But when white units broke and ran, it was called a tactical withdrawal, or being overwhelmed. When the 24th Infantry faced the same odds, the whispers started immediately. The Negroes are running. The reality on the ground was a nightmare. The 24th was thrown into the line at the very tip of the spear, tasked with delaying a North Korean army that was moving with the speed and ferocity of a freight train. The terrain was brutal: steep, jagged mountains, rice paddies filled with human waste, heat that choked the lungs, and the enemy was everywhere. The North Koreans didn't just attack from the front. They infiltrated. They dressed as refugees. They moved at night. They encircled American positions, cutting off supply lines. The 24th faced shortages of everything. They had old radios that didn't work in the mountains. Their bazookas bounced off the hulls of the T-34 tanks. They were often sent into battle without maps, without adequate ammunition, and without food. But their biggest deficit was leadership. The white officers leading the 24th had a habit that would become deadly. They led from the rear. Way in the rear. While the black lieutenants and sergeants were on the ridgelines, fighting hand to hand, the battalion and regimental commanders stayed in their command posts, miles away, safe and disconnected. When the fighting got hot, these commanders often lost contact with their companies. And when they lost contact, they assumed the worst. Instead of going up to the line to rally their men, instead of sending reinforcements, they picked up their radios and reported to division headquarters that the troops have bugged out. They wrote reports blaming the panic of the black soldiers for the loss of ground, covering up their own tactical incompetence and cowardice. They were writing the history of the battle before the smoke had even cleared, creating a narrative that would doom the regiment. But what was actually happening on those ridges? Far from running, the men of the 24th were fighting with a desperate improvised courage. They were holding positions that were tactically indefensible. There are accounts of black machine gunners staying at their posts until they were overrun, stacking enemy bodies in front of their foxholes. There are stories of squads fixing bayonets because they had run out of bullets, charging into the dark to buy time for the rest of the army to retreat. Yet, the bug-out label stuck. It was catchy. It fit the prejudices of the high command. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters began to view the 24th as a liability. The press picked up the story. Correspondents, drinking in the officers' clubs in Tokyo, repeated the slander they heard from white colonels. The unreliability of the 24th became a known fact, without any investigation into the reality. One of the most egregious examples of this betrayal occurred in late July. The regiment was holding a town called Yekon. The fighting was fierce. The North Koreans were pushing hard, trying to break the Pusan Perimeter, the last line of defense. If the perimeter broke, the Americans would be pushed into the sea, and the war would be lost. The 24th was the only thing standing in the way. The official reports from the time, the reports that would stand for 40 years, claimed that the 24th performed poorly at Yechon, that they were disorganized and ineffective. But the truth, buried in the memories of the survivors and the local Korean civilians, was radically different. Yechon was not a defeat. It was a turning point. It was the moment where the 24th Infantry Regiment, despite their poor equipment, despite their racist commanders, and despite the chaos, stood up and delivered the first major American ground victory of the war. But the Army didn't want a victory from the 24th. They wanted a scapegoat. As the summer of 1950 burned on, the disconnect between the men on the line and the officers in the rear grew into a chasm. The black soldiers knew their commanders didn't care if they lived or died. They knew they were being used as cannon fodder to buy time for the real white army to get organized. Yet, they kept fighting. They fought for each other. They fought because they were Buffalo soldiers, and they had a legacy to protect. The tragedy of the 24th Infantry is not that they failed. It is that they succeeded in the face of impossible odds, and the success was stolen from them. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the North Koreans with rifles and mortars, and one against their own headquarters with typewriters and reports. And the enemy with the typewriters proved to be far more lethal to their legacy. We are about to walk through the fire with them. We are going to look at the Battle of Yekon, the defense of Haman, and the Battle of the Notch. We are going to see men performing acts of valor that would have earned a white soldier the Medal of Honor, only to be ignored. We are going to expose the systemic rot of a military that decided it was better to slander its own heroes than to admit that a black regiment saved the line. The 24th Infantry Regiment was erased, but today we are writing them back in. This is the story of the Deuce Four, and it starts with the victory the Army tried to hide. July 20th, 1950. The war was less than a month old, but it had already become a rout. The North Korean juggernaut was unstoppable. They had crushed the South Korean capital of Seoul in days. They had humiliated the first American units thrown in their path, specifically Task Force Smith, which had been scattered like leaves in a hurricane. The entire United Nations front was collapsing backward, compressing into a tiny, desperate box around the port city of Pusan. If the line broke here, there would be no evacuation like Dunkirk. There would just be a massacre at the water's edge. The town of Yechon sat at a critical juncture. It was a vital rail and road hub. If the North Koreans took it and held it, they could flank the American lines and drive a dagger straight into the heart of the retreat. The enemy knew this. They slammed into Yechon with a reinforced battalion, supported by artillery, driving out the South Korean defenders and digging in. The town was burning. The hills overlooking it were crawling with communist troops. The order came down to the 24th Infantry Regiment. Take Yechon back. For a white regiment, this would have been a standard order. For the 24th, it was a test designed to break them. They were tired. They were hungry. Their equipment was World War II surplus junk that jammed in the humidity. And their white regimental commanders were already whispering that the task was impossible for troops of this caliber. The expectation in the command tent was failure. The officers in the rear were already mentally drafting the reports, blaming the inevitable defeat on the inherent weakness of their men. But the men of the 24th, specifically the 3rd Battalion, didn't get the memo that they were supposed to fail. The assault on Yekon began not with a grand strategy, but with a grunt's reality, moving uphill, under fire, into the teeth of a dug-in enemy. The terrain around the town was a nightmare of steep, scrub-covered ridges that offered perfect cover for the defenders and none for the attackers. The heat was suffocating, a wet blanket of humidity that made every breath a struggle. This is where the leadership dynamic of the 24th was laid bare. As the companies moved out, crossing the rice paddies that surrounded the town, the incoming fire began. It was the terrifying burp of the Soviet-made PPSH submachine guns, burp guns, and the sharp crack of mortars. In a healthy unit, the officers would be at the front, directing fire, rallying the men, pushing the line forward. But in the 24th, a disturbing pattern emerged. Many of the white officers, the captains and majors, established their command posts remarkably far back. They were managing the battle from the safety of the radio handset, not the reality of the ridgeline. The leadership vacuum at the front was filled instantly by the black lieutenants and the NCOs, the sergeants and corporals. These were the Buffalo Soldiers, men who had served in Italy or the Pacific, or young men who had joined the army to prove they were equal citizens. They realized that if they waited for orders from the rear, they would die in the paddies. So they took charge. "Follow me" wasn't just a slogan, it was a necessity. Black platoon leaders stood up in the grass, exposing themselves to fire to pinpoint the enemy machine guns. They organized the squads. They coordinated the movement. They turned a chaotic advance into a disciplined assault. The battle for Yekon raged for 16 brutal hours. It was house to house, ridge to ridge fighting. The 24th pushed into the burning town, engaging the North Koreans at close quarters. This wasn't a long-range duel. It was grenades and bayonets. It was intimate violence. The North Koreans, who had grown accustomed to seeing Americans retreat at the first sign of pressure, were shocked. These Americans weren't running. They were coming forward with a relentless, grinding aggression. By the evening of July 21st, the guns fell silent. The smoke drifted over the ruined buildings. The 24th Infantry Regiment had done the impossible. They had retaken Yekon. They had driven the North Koreans out, secured the high ground, and stabilized the flank of the entire 8th Army. It was the first significant American ground victory of the Korean War. Let that sink in. The first time the U.S. Army stopped the North Koreans, took back a town, and held it. It wasn't the elite Marines or the storied airborne divisions who did it. It was the segregated, unreliable, cowardly 24th Infantry Regiment. The men of the 24th were jubilant. They had proven it. They had looked the enemy in the eye and beaten him. They expected, perhaps naively, that this would change everything. They expected their officers to say, "Good job." They expected the press to trumpet the victory. They expected the bug-out rumors to die in the ashes of Yecheon. Instead, they got silence. And then they got slander. When the reports filtered back to division and corps headquarters, the skepticism was immediate. The 24th took Yekon? Impossible. The white commanders couldn't reconcile their prejudice with the reality on the map. They rationalized it away. They claimed the North Koreans must have just withdrawn on their own. They claimed the resistance must have been light. They claimed the 24th had simply walked into an empty town. The official Army communiques downplayed the victory. While some newspapers, notably the New York Times and the black press, like the Chicago Defender, reported the success, the internal narrative of the Army refused to shift. The victory was treated as a fluke, an anomaly. The officers who had stayed in the rear wrote reports that emphasized the confusion of the battle, rather than the outcome. They focused on the stragglers, the men who got lost, rather than the men who took the hill. This was the beginning of the bug-out myth. It was a psychological operation conducted by the U.S. Army against its own troops. The term bug-out became a catch-all phrase for any retreat involving the 24th. If a white unit retreated because they were outnumbered, it was a tactical withdrawal. If the 24th retreated because they were outnumbered, it was bug-out fever. The double standard was lethal. In the weeks following Yecheon, the 24th was thrown into battle, after battle, without rest. They were kept on the line for 60 days straight. No unit can sustain that. Fatigue sets in. Mental breakdowns happen. But for the 24th, every sign of fatigue was interpreted as racial inferiority. The conditions were medieval. The men were rotting in their boots. They were drinking water from paddies fertilized with human waste, leading to rampant dysentery. A soldier with dysentery can barely stand, let alone fight up a mountain. Yet, when black soldiers collapsed from illness, white doctors and officers frequently accused them of malingering, faking it to get out of combat. There is a documented instance where a white officer, seeing a group of black soldiers resting on the side of a road after days of continuous fighting, reported them as stragglers who had abandoned their positions. He didn't ask them where they had been. He didn't check their ammo pouches to see that they were empty. He saw black men sitting down, and his prejudice filled in the blanks. He wrote "cowardice" in his notebook, and that notebook became history. Meanwhile, the heroic acts of the black officers and NCOs were systematically ignored. Lieutenants who led charges that saved their platoons were passed over for silver stars. Enlisted men who single-handedly held off enemy squads were ignored. The awards system, the currency of military honor, was bankrupt for the 24th. The tragedy of Yecheon is that it should have been the turning point for integration. It should have been the moment the Army realized, these men can fight if we lead them properly. Instead, it became the moment the Army decided that the truth didn't matter. The brass had a narrative to maintain. They believed segregation was natural and right. If the 24th succeeded, it threatened that worldview. So, consciously or subconsciously, the success had to be minimized. The victory at Yekon became a ghost victory. The men knew they won. The Koreans knew they won. But the army paperwork said it didn't count. And as the regiment moved deeper into the summer, toward the bloody defense of the Pusan Perimeter, the weight of this betrayal began to crush morale. How do you fight for a country that refuses to acknowledge your victories? How do you follow officers who you know are writing lies about you? The 24th didn't stop fighting, but the war had changed for them. They weren't just fighting to hold the line anymore. They were fighting to survive their own chain of command. And the next test, the defense of the city of Haman and the Battle of the Notch, would bring this internal war to a boiling point. The North Koreans were preparing a massive knockout blow, and the 24th was standing right in the path of the hammer. The Unwanted Regiment was about to be asked to save the 8th Army again, while the men with the typewriters sharpened their knives. August 1950, the Pusan Perimeter. If you look at a map of the Korean War from that summer, it looks like a thumb pressing down on a dying insect. The United Nations forces had been pushed into a tiny, rectangular box in the southeast corner of the peninsula, with the Sea of Japan at their backs. There was nowhere left to retreat. The order from Lieutenant General Walton Walker was blunt and terrifying. Stand or die. There would be no evacuation. If the line broke here, the war was over, and the slaughter would be absolute. The 24th Infantry Regiment was assigned to the western edge of this perimeter, guarding a sector of jagged peaks and narrow valleys near the town of Haman. It was a piece of terrain that even a mountain goat would find inhospitable. The central feature was a towering, craggy peak known as Sobuksan, but the soldiers simply called it Battle Mountain. For 6 weeks, this mountain would become a revolving door of death. It would change hands 13 times. The 24th would take it by day, fighting uphill in the roasting heat, and the North Koreans would swarm it by night, pouring over the crest in human waves. This is where the physical and psychological disintegration of the regiment began, accelerated not by the enemy, but by the poison of its own chain of command. To hold a position like Battle Mountain, there must be an absolute, unbreakable bond of trust between the officer and the rifleman. The soldier must know that if he stays in his foxhole and fights, his captain is right behind him, directing reinforcements, calling in artillery, and ensuring he doesn't get flanked. In the 24th Infantry, that bond didn't just snap, it never existed. The white regimental and battalion commanders, men like Colonel Arthur Champney, who took command later in the summer, viewed their arrival at the 24th as a career death sentence. Champney was openly hostile. He reportedly told the exhausted men, who had been fighting for weeks without rest, that they were a frightened, nervous mob, and that he would make soldiers out of them or die trying. It was a speech designed to humiliate, not inspire. This attitude trickled down. While the black soldiers were sweating and bleeding on the slopes of Sobuksan, many of the white officers established their command posts miles to the rear, in comfortable schoolhouses or villages far beyond the range of enemy mortars. They managed the battle by telephone. They didn't walk the line. They didn't check the night watches. They treated the war like a remote administrative problem. So, when the North Koreans attacked, and they always attacked at night, with green flares and terrifying cacophony, the black soldiers on the line often felt completely abandoned. They would call for artillery support, only to be told the batteries were busy or the coordinates were wrong. They would call for reinforcements, only to hear silence. When the enemy infiltrated the lines, which is standard tactic in mountain warfare, the isolated platoons would often pull back to consolidate, a standard military maneuver called a retrograde. But when a white unit pulled back to consolidate, it was adjusting the line. When the black troops of the 24th pulled back because they were surrounded and leaderless, the officers in the rear, staring at their maps and not the terrain, labeled it a bug out. The night of August 31st broke the dam. The North Koreans launched a massive, coordinated offensive across the entire Pusan Perimeter. They hit the 24th Infantry sector with overwhelming force. It was a chaotic, confusing nightmare. Units were cut off. Comms lines were slashed. The North Koreans were inside the perimeter, attacking command posts and artillery positions from the rear. In the confusion, elements of the 24th fell back. It was a messy retreat in the dark, under heavy fire. But elements of every division on the line fell back that night. The white 25th Division buckled. The 2nd Division took heavy hits. The perimeter was bending everywhere. But the reaction to the 24th was different. The narrative was already written. Reports flashed up to 8th Army headquarters. The 24th has collapsed. The Negroes are running. Panic in Haman. The press, hungry for a simple story to explain the terrifying North Korean advance, latched onto it. They ignored the fact that the 24th had held Battle Mountain for weeks. They ignored the fact that the unit had been kept on the line far longer than any white unit without rotation. They printed the bug-out story. It became the bug-out ballad, a song of ridicule. But the graves on Sobuksan tell the truth that the newspapers missed. When the sun rose and the counterattacks began to retake the lost ground, the bodies of the 24th Infantry soldiers were found. They weren't shot in the back while running away. They were found in their foxholes. They were found slumped over their machine guns, surrounded by piles of spent brass. They were found with empty clips and bayonets fixed. There is the story of Private First Class William Thompson. During a chaotic firefight near Haman, his platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire. Thompson was wounded, hit by grenades and small arms. His platoon leader ordered a withdrawal to a better position. Thompson refused to leave. He knew that if the machine gun wasn't suppressed, his friends would be cut down as they moved. He told his squad, "Get out of here, I'll handle this." PFC Thompson stayed behind. He manned his machine gun, bleeding into the dirt, and opened fire on the advancing North Koreans. He drew the entire weight of the enemy attack onto himself. His squadmates heard his gun firing for a long time, slowing the enemy, buying them precious minutes to escape. Then, the gun went silent. When they reclaimed the hill, they found Thompson surrounded by dead North Koreans. He hadn't bugged out. He had dug in. He became the first African American to be awarded the Medal of Honor in the Korean War, though, tragically, it was awarded posthumously and took years to process compared to white recipients. Yet, Thompson's sacrifice was drowned out by the noise of the slander. The officers who had failed to lead used the chaos of Haman to cover their own incompetence. They initiated mass court-martials. Dozens of black soldiers were arrested and charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy. It was a purge. The legal proceedings were shams. Men were convicted on the hearsay of officers who weren't even at the battle. It was a desperate attempt by the Army to legally certify the inferiority of the black soldier, to put a judicial stamp on the myth. The tragedy of the Pusan Perimeter for the 24th wasn't that they lost ground. It was that they were fighting a ghost. They were fighting the ghost of the lazy slave that lived in the minds of their commanders. No matter how many North Koreans they killed, no matter how many times they retook Battle Mountain, they couldn't kill that ghost. As September arrived, the tide of the war turned. General MacArthur launched the brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, far to the north. The North Korean army, caught in a vice, began to disintegrate. The pressure on the Pusan Perimeter lifted. The 8th Army broke out and began the long chase north. The 24th Infantry joined the pursuit. They marched north, liberating towns, capturing prisoners, doing the hard work of an infantry regiment on the advance. But the damage was done. The morale of the unit was shattered. The men knew their reputation was in tatters. They knew the army was looking for an excuse to get rid of them. They had become the unwanted children of the war effort. But they kept moving. They moved because they had no choice, and because, despite everything, they were soldiers. They were Buffalo Soldiers. And as they crossed the 38th parallel, heading into the unknown of North Korea, they were about to face their final and most deadly test. The Chinese were coming. And when the Chinese entered the war, the chaos of Haman would look like a skirmish. The 24th would be thrown into a valley of death from which there was no escape, and the final chapter of their betrayal would be written not in ink, but in the ice of the Kunu-ri Gauntlet. The bug-out myth was about to be tested against the reality of total annihilation, and the world would see who really ran and who stood and fought. October 1950. The United States Army was suffering from a fatal case of victory disease. The North Korean army had effectively evaporated. The Incheon landing had worked. The Pusan Perimeter had held. Now, the entire UN force was streaming north, crossing the 38th parallel, pushing toward the Yalu River, the border with China. The talk in the mess tents wasn't about fighting. It was about the victory parade in Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur, blinded by his own legend, famously promised the troops they would be home by Christmas. The men of the 24th Infantry Regiment marched north with a cautious, weary optimism. They had survived the heat of Haman and the slander of their own officers. Now, they walked through the autumn landscapes of North Korea, capturing towns that surrendered without a shot. The air was crisp. The leaves were turning. For a brief moment, it felt like they had survived the storm. But they were walking into a trap so massive, so well concealed, that it would go down as one of the greatest intelligence failures in American military history. While MacArthur was measuring himself for a laurel wreath, 300,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army were slipping across the Yalu River at night. They moved like ghosts. They wore rubber-soled shoes that made no sound. They carried simple weapons, rifles, grenades, and satchel charges. They had no tanks, no air force, and very little artillery. But they had numbers. They had discipline, and they had the element of surprise. They hid in the rugged mountains during the day, motionless under camouflage nets, while American planes flew overhead, seeing nothing. And then the weather turned. The Siberian Express roared down the peninsula. The temperature plunged from autumn chill to Arctic nightmare in 48 hours. The wind screamed through the valleys, dropping the mercury to 30 degrees below zero. The 24th Infantry, like much of the segregated army, was at the bottom of the supply chain. While white units received winter parkas and insulated Mickey Mouse boots, many men in the 24th were marching into the teeth of a blizzard, wearing summer fatigues and leather combat boots that froze to their feet. They wrapped their bodies in newspapers and rags to keep from freezing to death. The cold was an enemy as lethal as the North Koreans had been. It sapped the will to fight. It jammed weapons. It turned morale into brittle ice. On November 25th, the trap was sprung. It didn't begin with an artillery barrage. It began with a sound that every veteran of that winter would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Bugles. Eerie, discordant bugles blowing in the dark, accompanied by whistles and the crashing of gongs. The Chinese attacked the 8th Army, not from the front, but from everywhere. They swarmed over the ridges, cutting supply roads, encircling battalions, creating pockets of chaos. The entire American front line disintegrated. The 24th Infantry was stationed near the Chongchon River, serving as the flank guard for the 25th Infantry Division. When the Chinese hit, they hit with human waves. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, and confusing. In the swirling snow and darkness, command and control broke down completely. This is where the narrative of the 24th takes another tragic turn. Under the crushing weight of the Chinese offensive, the entire 8th Army retreated. White regiments broke. South Korean divisions evaporated. The mighty 2nd Infantry Division was mauled. But once again, the telescope of blame was focused singularly on the black soldiers. When a white battalion fell back, it was reported as being overwhelmed by hordes. When a battalion of the 24th fell back under the same pressure, the radios crackled with the old slur, "The 24th is bugging out." But the retreat from the Chongchon River wasn't a bug out. It was a fight for survival against encirclement. The 24th fought desperate rearguard actions, holding bridges and crossroads to allow the rest of the division to escape. They burned their own trucks to keep them from the enemy. They carried their wounded until they dropped. And then came the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet refers to a 6-mile stretch of road running south from the town of Kunu-ri to Suncheon. It was a narrow, dirt track winding through a valley with steep cliffs on both sides. The Chinese had anticipated the American retreat. They had set up a firing gallery along the entire 6 miles. They placed machine guns and mortar teams on the cliffs, looking down on the road. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, along with elements of the 24th and other units, had to run this gauntlet to escape. It was a highway of death. As the convoy of trucks, jeeps, and tanks entered the valley, the Chinese opened fire. It was a slaughter. Vehicles at the front and rear were knocked out, trapping the column. Mortars rained down on open trucks packed with freezing soldiers. The road became a river of fire and blood. Men were screaming, burning, dying. The only way to survive was to run, to jump out of the trucks and sprint through the ditch, dodging bullets, scrambling over the bodies of the fallen. In this chaotic inferno, the myth of the cowardly black soldier was incinerated by the reality of black heroism. There are accounts of black truck drivers from the 24th driving their vehicles through walls of flame, refusing to abandon the wounded men in the back. There are stories of the 24th's segregated tank crews staying behind, parking their Shermans in the middle of the road to act as steel shields, firing their 76mm guns into the cliffs until they ran out of ammo or were overrun. But the most damning aspect of the gauntlet wasn't the Chinese fire. It was the abandonment by the American command. General Edward Almond, the commander of X Corps, though the 24th was 8th Army, Almond's attitude permeated the theater, was a virulent racist who had little regard for his black troops. The white officers of the 24th, many of whom had already proven their incompetence, once again failed their men. In the chaos of the retreat, many officers simply vanished. They jumped on the first jeep out, leaving their companies leaderless in the snow. The black NCOs, the sergeants who had held the line at Yechon, stepped up again. They organized the stragglers. They formed ad hoc platoons of black and white soldiers mixed together by necessity. For a few terrifying hours in the gauntlet, integration happened naturally. A white kid from Georgia didn't care that the man pulling him into a ditch was black. He just knew that man was saving his life. The carnage was horrific. The 2nd Division and the attached units lost nearly 3,000 men in a single afternoon. The road was paved with American dead. When the survivors finally staggered into Suncheon, they looked like the walking dead. They were frozen, bleeding, wide-eyed with trauma. But for the men of the 24th, the ordeal wasn't over. As they regrouped, shivering in the cold, they heard the rumors starting again. The disaster at Kunu-ri was being blamed on weak flanks. And who was holding the flanks? The 24th. The narrative was being twisted in real time. The massive intelligence failure of MacArthur, the tactical incompetence of the white generals who sent an army into a trap, all of that was being deflected. The 24th became the convenient scapegoat for the collapse of the entire front. If the 24th had held, the officers whispered, we wouldn't have been trapped. It was a lie. A single regiment could not have stopped 300,000 Chinese soldiers. but it was a useful lie. It protected the careers of the men with stars on their shoulders by sacrificing the men with stripes on their sleeves. The winter of 1950-1951 became a long, dark night of the soul for the regiment. They were pushed all the way back into South Korea. They were demoralized. They had seen their friends die in the gauntlet, only to be told it was their own fault. The trust between the black soldiers and their white commanders was completely shattered. There were incidents of soldiers refusing to follow orders because they knew the orders were suicide. There were whispers of mutiny, not out of cowardice, but out of a refusal to be thrown away. Yet, even in this abyss, they didn't break. They endured the Great Retreat. They reorganized. And as the spring of 1951 approached and the UN forces prepared to push back north again, the 24th Infantry Regiment stood ready. They were battered. Their reputation was in tatters. But they were still standing. They didn't know it yet, but the final act of their tragedy was being prepared in Washington and Tokyo. The Army had decided that the experiment of the 24th was over. They weren't going to fix the leadership. They weren't going to give them better equipment. They were going to kill the regiment. But before the flag was furled, the 24th would have to fight one last series of battles. They would have to bleed one last time for a country that had already decided they were guilty. The bug-out myth had become official doctrine, and the men of the Deuce Four were about to become the ghosts of the Korean War, men whose sacrifice was erased to save the pride of a segregated nation. But the snows of Kunu-ri remember, and we remember. The spring of 1951 brought a thaw to the frozen rivers of Korea, but it brought no warmth to the men of the 24th Infantry Regiment. They had survived the gauntlet. They had survived the Siberian Express, but they were a hollowed-out force. A military unit is like a living organism. It relies on a central nervous system of trust to function. In the 24th, that nervous system had been severed. The enlisted men no longer looked at their white officers with expectation or respect. They looked at them with a simmering, quiet hostility. They knew they were being led by men who regarded them as a burden, men who were writing their obituaries and after-action reports before the bullets even started flying. The morale was at rock bottom. The bug-out label hung over them like a curse, a self-fulfilling prophecy that the Army leadership seemed determined to realize. Yet, military history is full of paradoxes, and the final months of the 24th Infantry produced some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire war. Under the new leadership of General Matthew Ridgway, who took command of the 8th Army after General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident, the entire tenor of the war changed. Ridgway was a paratrooper, a man who wore grenades on his chest and despised cowardice in any form, whether from a private or a general. He looked at the 24th and saw a wasted asset. He didn't see a genetic failure. He saw a failure of command. Ridgway ordered the Army to get off the roads and into the hills. He launched Operation Ripper and Operation Rugged, massive counteroffensives designed to push the Chinese and North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. The 24th was thrown back into the meat grinder, and once again, despite the exhaustion, despite the rot in the officer corps, individual black soldiers rose to the occasion with a valor that shamed their critics. The defining moment of this final phase, and the spiritual epitaph of the regiment, occurred on a nameless hill near the village of Chip-o-ri in June 1951. It is the story of Sergeant Cornelius Charlton. Charlton was a big man, a West Virginian who had joined the Army out of high school because he believed in the promise of America. He was assigned to Company C of the 24th. During the assault on Hill 543, his platoon was hammered. The enemy was dug into concrete bunkers on the crest of the steep ridge, raining machine gun fire and grenades down on the advancing Americans. The platoon's white lieutenant was killed almost instantly. The unit stalled, pinned down in the dirt, leaderless and terrified. In the racist logic of the 1925 Army War College study, this was the moment the black soldiers were supposed to panic. This was the moment for the bug out. Instead, Sergeant Charlton stood up. He took command of the platoon. He didn't radio for permission. He just acted. He rallied the broken men, shouting orders, forcing them to focus. He led them back up the hill, crawling through the brush, suppressing the enemy fire with his carbine. The platoon destroyed the first two enemy positions, but the fire from the summit was intensifying. Charlton was hit in the chest. The wound was mortal. He was bleeding heavily, his lungs filling with fluid. Most men would have called for a medic. Most men would have accepted that they had done enough. But Cornelius Charlton was a Buffalo soldier, and he wasn't leaving that hill until the job was done. He refused medical attention. He reorganized his men for one final push. The last remaining enemy bunker on the reverse slope was decimating them. Charlton decided to take it out alone. He charged the bunker. He was hit again, this time by a grenade blast, but he kept moving. He reached the aperture of the bunker, fired his carbine until it clicked dry, and then threw his last grenades inside. The explosion silenced the gun. When the rest of the platoon reached the top, they found the bunker destroyed and the enemy dead. And they found Sergeant Charlton slumped over his weapon, dead from his wounds. He had single-handedly broken the main line of resistance. He had saved his platoon. Cornelius Charlton was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the second black soldier of the Korean War to receive it, joining William Thompson. But the tragedy lies in the timing. While Charlton was bleeding to death on Hill 543 to save his country, men in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo were finalizing the paperwork to destroy his regiment. The decision to disband the 24th Infantry wasn't made because of a sudden moral awakening about the evils of segregation. It was made because segregation had become a logistical and military nightmare. The Project Clear study, commissioned by the Army and conducted by social scientists from Johns Hopkins University, was the smoking gun. The Army wanted data to decide what to do with its black troops. They sent researchers into Korea to interview officers and enlisted men. The findings of Project Clear were a mirror reflecting the Army's own sickness. The study found that segregated black units performed worse than white units, but not because black men couldn't fight. They performed worse because they were consistently given the worst officers, the worst equipment, and the lowest priority for support. The study explicitly stated that when black soldiers were integrated into white units, they fought just as well as their white counterparts. But the Army leadership twisted the narrative. They didn't say, "We failed the 24th by giving them racist commanders." They said, "The 24th is a failure, so we must break it up." The disbandment was framed not as a correction of injustice, but as a disposal of a defective product. The white commanders of the 24th, eager to wash their hands of the problem, endorsed the plan enthusiastically. They wanted the integration to happen, not because they believed in equality, but because they wanted to command white troops again. They believed that by scattering the black soldiers across the Army, the quota system, they could dilute the weakness of the black race. It was integration born of cynicism, not idealism. In the summer of 1951, the rumors began to circulate through the foxholes. The Deuce 4 was going away. The colors, the battle flag that had flown over San Juan Hill in Cuba, over the muddy trenches of the Pacific, and over the rice paddies of Yechon, were going to be cased. For the men who had fought for the regiment, who had bled for the buffalo symbol on their shoulder patch, this was a complex, heartbreaking moment. On one hand, they hated the 24th. They hated the segregation, the bad officers, the stigma. They wanted to be treated like regular soldiers. Integration offered a chance at fairness. On the other hand, the 24th was theirs. It was their history. It was the legacy of their grandfathers. To disband it felt like admitting defeat. It felt like accepting the lie that they weren't good enough to have their own unit. The final days of the regiment were somber. There was no grand parade. There was no speech from the president thanking them for holding the Pusan Perimeter. On October 1st, 1951, the order officially took effect. The 24th Infantry Regiment was deactivated. The men were transferred. They were loaded onto trucks and scattered like seeds across the 2nd, 3rd, and 25th Divisions. They took off their buffalo patches and sewed on the Indian head or the tropic lightning. And a strange thing happened. Almost overnight, the cowardice evaporated. The same men who had been labeled bug-out artists in the 24th suddenly became model soldiers in the 25th Division. Why? Because for the first time, they were treated like soldiers. They had white officers who expected them to fight, not to run. They had supplies. They had support. When a black private was placed in a foxhole next to a white private, the racism didn't disappear, but the dynamic changed. They depended on each other. The black soldiers, hardened veterans of the first brutal year of the war, often had more combat experience than the white replacements coming in. They became the mentors. The instant success of the integrated black soldiers proved, definitively and scientifically, that the failure of the 24th was never about the men. It was about the system. The bug-out was a fabrication created by a segregated command structure to excuse its own incompetence. But the damage to history was already done. The 24th was gone, and the official record of the Korean War was written by the victors of the bureaucratic battle. The Army history books codified the slander. They wrote that the 24th was disbanded because it was unreliable. They cemented the lie for future generations. For 40 years, the veterans of the 24th lived in the shadow of this lie. They came home to an America that didn't care about the Korean War, the forgotten war, and cared even less about black veterans. They watched as movies were made about the Marines at Chosin and the Army at Heartbreak Ridge, but never about Yukon. They saw their service dismissed as a joke. The Bug-Out Brigade. Imagine the pain of a man like David Barclay or William Thompson, heroes who died for their country, having their sacrifice mocked by the very institution they served. Imagine the anger of the survivors, knowing the truth of what happened on Battle Mountain, but having no way to tell it against the weight of the Pentagon's official story. They had been erased, but the grave is not a silent place. The truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, and as the decades passed, a new fight began. It wasn't a fight against North Koreans. It was a fight against the Army's own archives. The survivors of the Deuce 4 were getting old, but they weren't done fighting. They wanted their honor back, and they were about to launch the final offensive of the 24th Infantry Regiment, a battle for the truth that would reach the highest levels of the United States government. The Unwanted regiment was coming back from the dead to demand an apology. When the guns finally fell silent in Korea in July 1953, a strange and heavy amnesia settled over the United States. The Korean War was not like World War II. There was no VE Day, no ticker tape parades, no clear moral victory. It was a stalemate, a bloody draw that left the country exhausted and confused. It was quickly dubbed the Forgotten War. But for the veterans of the 24th Infantry Regiment, the war was not just forgotten. It was actively suppressed. They returned to a country that was embarrassed by the conflict and specifically ashamed of them. For the next 40 years, the bug-out myth didn't just survive. It hardened into academic concrete. It wasn't just a rumor shared in bars anymore. It became the official history of the United States Army. In 1961, the Army published its definitive history of the conflict, a massive tome titled South to the Nakhtong, North to the Yalu. The author, Roy Appelman, a military historian, codified the slander. Relying almost exclusively on the interviews and reports of the white commanders who had failed their men, Appelman wrote that the 24th Infantry was unreliable, panic-prone, and fundamentally incapable of sustained combat. This book became the Bible of the Korean War. It was taught at West Point. It was studied at the War College. Generations of future officers, the men who would lead the Army in Vietnam and Desert Storm, were educated on the lie that black soldiers in the 24th had failed because of their race. The text didn't mention the lack of supplies. It didn't mention the racist leadership. It didn't mention the victory at Yekun. It presented the failure of the 24th as a cold, hard, objective fact. Imagine the psychological violence of this. Imagine being a veteran of the 24th, a man who had held the line at Haman or run the gauntlet at Kunu-ri. You know the truth. You know you fought. You know your friends died brave deaths. But when you go to the library, when you watch a documentary, when you hear a general speak, they tell you that you ran away. You are gaslighted by your own government. Your sacrifice is not just ignored, it is inverted. You are not a hero. You are a cautionary tale. This erasure had a profound impact on the black community's relationship with the military. While the integrated army of the Vietnam era was becoming a place of opportunity, the shadow of the 24th lingered. Black officers knew that they had to be twice as good to overcome the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers in Korea. The lie was a stain that wouldn't wash out. But the veterans of the Deuce 4 were resilient men. They had survived the Chinese army. They could survive the historians. They formed the 24th Infantry Regiment Association. For decades, it was a small, insular group. They met in hotel ballrooms and VFW halls, gray-haired men with scars on their bodies and fire in their bellies. They told their stories to each other because no one else would listen. They kept the names of William Thompson and Cornelius Charlton alive. They created a repository of truth in a world of lies. The turning point came not from the military, but from the changing moral tide of the nation. As the civil rights movement reshaped America, the historical narrative began to crack. In the 1980s and 90s, a new wave of scholarship began to question the official histories. Black historians and investigative journalists started looking at the primary documents again. They found the holes in Appleman's narrative. They found the court-martial transcripts that read like kangaroo courts. They found the letters from white officers admitting they hated their troops. The pressure mounted. In the early 1990s, following a similar review that resulted in the upgrading of medals of honor for black veterans of Waitasauts, the demand for a review of the 24th Infantry reached the Pentagon. The survivors weren't asking for money. They were asking for their honor. They wanted the Army to admit that the bug-out was a lie manufactured to cover up the failures of segregation. In 1996, the United States Army did something extraordinary. It launched a massive, independent investigation into its own conduct during the Korean War. It was called the 24th Infantry Regiment Study. It was conducted by a team of historians and analysts who were given unrestricted access to the archives. They interviewed hundreds of surviving veterans, both black and white. They analyzed the terrain, the enemy troop movements, and the supply logs. The results, published later that year, were a bombshell. The report dismantled the myth of the 24th piece by piece. It concluded, unequivocally, that the 24th Infantry Regiment had been the victim of institutional racism. It stated that the unit was hampered by inept and racist leadership at the command level. It found that while there were instances of straggling, as there were in all units during the chaotic retreats of 1950, the regiment as a whole fought with determination and courage. The study validated what the veterans had been saying for 46 years. It confirmed that the 24th had seized Yecheon. It confirmed that they had held the line at Haman despite being abandoned by their commanders. It confirmed that the disbandment of the unit was a political move, not a military necessity. The Army admitted that it had blamed the soldiers for the failures of the generals. This admission was historic. It is rare for any government, let alone the most powerful military in the world, to look in the mirror and admit we lied about our own heroes. The report was a vindication, but it was also a tragedy. It came 46 years too late. Many of the men who had been court-martialed, humiliated, and discharged were dead. They died believing the country thought they were cowards. The apology could not reach them in the grave. But for the survivors, the men in their 70s and 80s who gathered to hear the results, it was a moment of profound, shaking relief. The stigma was lifted. They could look their grandchildren in the eye and show them the official Army report that said, "We were good soldiers." The rehabilitation of the regiment's legacy began in earnest. The Medal of Honor, citations for William Thompson and Cornelius Charlton, were dusted off and celebrated. Their faces were put on stamps and in museums. The story of the bug out was replaced by the story of the Buffalo Soldiers of Korea. But there was one final piece of the puzzle that remained unresolved: the court-martials. During the panic of the Pusan Perimeter, dozens of black soldiers had been arrested, charged with cowardice, and thrown into military prisons. They were branded felons. They lost their voting rights. They lost their veteran benefits. Their lives were ruined by convictions based on racism and panic. Even after the 1996 report admitted the systemic bias, these convictions remained on the books. It would take another fight, another push by lawyers and activists to begin the process of overturning these convictions. It was a slow, legal grind. But case by case, the Army began to set aside the verdicts. They issued honorable discharges to men who had been dead for decades. They restored the ranks of men who had been stripped of their stripes. One of the most poignant symbols of this new era involves the Korean people themselves. While the American history books were slandering the 24th, the people of Yecheon never forgot. In the town of Yecheon, there is a school, and the elders of that town tell the children that they are free today because the black soldiers came back down the hills and drove the communists away. They remembered the faces of the men who saved them, even when the Pentagon did not. The legacy of the 24th Infantry Regiment is now clear. They were the crucible in which the integrated army was forged. Their suffering exposed the lie of segregation so thoroughly that the military had no choice but to abandon it. The integrated army that fought in Vietnam, the army that stormed across the desert in Iraq with Colin Powell, a black general, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that army was built on the ruins of the 24th. The Deuce 4 was the sacrificial lamb of the American military. They bore the sins of the nation's racism so that the future force could be born without them. It is a heavy, bitter legacy, but it is also a glorious one. As we move to the final conclusion of this story, we must ask ourselves, what do we owe these men? We cannot give them back their youth. We cannot undo the insults. But we can give them the one thing they fought for. The one thing that was stolen from them in 1950 and hidden in a book in 1961. We can give them the truth. We can ensure that when the history of the Korean War is told, the 24th Infantry Regiment is not listed as a failure, but as a unit that fought 2 wars at once and won the most important one. They defeated the North Koreans at Yecheon, but more importantly, they defeated the lie of white supremacy in the United States Army. And they did it while bleeding. The publication of the Army's 1996 report was a victory. Yes, but it was a victory that tasted like ash. It was a bureaucratic confession, a paper apology for a flesh and blood crime. For the surviving veterans of the 24th Infantry Regiment, the men who were now in their 70s and 80s, the vindication brought a measure of peace, but it could not give them back the years they had spent living in the shadow of a lie. It could not return the lost career opportunities, the denied pensions, or the voting rights stripped away by unjust court-martials. The Army had finally told the truth, but it was a truth that came with a terrible realization. Their entire lives had been shaped by a deception manufactured by the very country they had fought to save. This brings us to the hidden cost of the 24th's erasure, the psychological toll of the double trauma. We often talk about PTSD in the context of combat, the nightmares of mortar fire, the smell of cordite, the sight of a friend torn apart. The men of the 24th carried all of that. They had seen the frozen hell of Chosin and the slaughterhouse of the Gauntlet. But layered on top of that combat trauma was a second, uniquely American trauma: the trauma of rejection. Imagine surviving the carnage of Yekon, holding the line when everyone expected you to run, only to return to base and be looked at with contempt by a white officer who had stayed in the rear. Imagine knowing you were a hero, but having the official record say you were a coward. This creates a cognitive dissonance that can shatter a man's mind. For decades, many veterans of the Deuce 4 suffered in silence, self-medicating with alcohol, withdrawing from their families, unable to reconcile the reality of their valor with the lie of their reputation. They were the silent generation within the silent generation, men who had locked their memories away because the world refused to validate them. But while the army tried to bury the regiment, the spirit of the Buffalo Soldiers did not disappear. It migrated. It moved from the foxholes of Korea to the streets of Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. The dismantling of the 24th Infantry Regiment in 1951 and the subsequent integration of the armed forces sent thousands of black men back into civilian life with a very specific set of skills and a new, hardened worldview. These men had seen the world. They had fought the Chinese army to a standstill. They had seen Japanese civilians treating them with more respect than their own neighbors in Alabama. They had held the power of life and death in their hands. You cannot take a man who has commanded a machine gun squad under fire, who has survived the Siberian Express, and expect him to come home and quietly accept that he cannot sit at a lunch counter. The bug-out lie may have hurt their reputation, but the combat experience had forged their spines. The veterans of the 24th became the foot soldiers and the tactical leaders of the civil rights movement. They were the men who didn't flinch when the police dogs were released. They were the men who organized the logistics of the freedom rides. They understood discipline. They understood that fear was a choice. When you have faced a human wave attack at night in sub-zero temperatures, a burning cross on a lawn loses its power to terrorize. The moral courage required to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was directly inherited from the physical courage required to hold Battle Mountain. The civil rights movement was, in many ways, the final campaign of the W2 Boyin and Korean War generation of black soldiers. A campaign to force America to pay the check for the freedom they had already purchased overseas. Furthermore, the failure of the 24th, which we now know was a failure of the system, not the men, became the catalyst for the greatest social experiment in American history: the fully integrated military. The Army didn't integrate because it wanted to. It integrated because the 24th proved that segregation was a military liability. The Project Clear report made it obvious. Segregation wasted manpower, duplicated logistics, and created weak links in the chain of command. By sacrificing the 24th, the Army inadvertently paved the way for the modern force. The 24th was the last of the Buffalo Soldiers, the final iteration of a segregated past. Its dissolution was the death knell of the idea that black men should serve apart. The integrated units that followed, the units that fought in Vietnam, were built on the ashes of the Deuce 4. In the jungles of Vietnam, black and white soldiers fought side by side, depended on each other, and died for each other in a way that was impossible in 1950. The blood of the 24th had greased the wheels of this transformation. But there is a bitter irony that we must confront. The Army integrated, yes, but for decades it integrated on white terms. The history of the black units was subsumed into the history of the white units they joined. The lineage of the 24th was put into a coma. The battle streamers on the regimental flag were put in a museum, while the active units celebrated the histories of the 7th Cavalry or the 101st Airborne. The specific, unique heritage of the black warrior, the tradition of the Buffalo Soldier, was in danger of being diluted into a generic Army green. This is why the work of the 24th Infantry Regiment Association was so critical. They weren't just a veterans club. They were the keepers of a sacred flame. They reminded the Army that integration shouldn't mean erasure. They fought to ensure that the names of William Thompson and Cornelius Charlton were spoken with the same reverence as Audie Murphy or Alvin York. Let's look closely at those two names again. Thompson and Charlton, two black sergeants, 2 medals of honor, both awarded posthumously. Both men died charging enemy positions to save their comrades. Their heroism was absolute. It was undeniable. Yet, for years, their stories were minimized. The citations were filed away. It wasn't until the review in the 1990s that the full scope of their valor was re-examined and celebrated by the wider public. The families of these men lived for decades with a mixture of pride and pain. They knew their sons and brothers were heroes, but the country didn't seem to care. When the Army finally held ceremonies to honor them properly, pinning the blue ribbons on weeping relatives, it was a moment of national penance. It was an admission that the system had been blind to the greatness within its own ranks. But medals do not bring back sons. The thank you was necessary, but it was also a reminder of the no that had preceded it for 40 years. The legacy of the 24th also challenges the modern myth of a colorblind military. We like to think that once the executive order was signed, racism vanished from the ranks. The story of the 24th proves that systems can be officially desegregated while remaining culturally toxic. It teaches us that diversity isn't just about the number of black faces in a platoon. It's about who holds the power, who writes the reports, and who controls the narrative. The 24th failed not because the soldiers were black, but because the power structure was white and hostile. This is a lesson that is still taught in military leadership courses today, a warning that a commander's prejudice is a strategic vulnerability that can lose a war. Today, if you walk through the Pentagon, you will see portraits of black generals. You will see African American officers leading the most elite units in the world. General Lloyd Austin, a black man, became the Secretary of Defense. General Colin Powell became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. These men are the direct beneficiaries of the suffering of the 24th. The 24th took the blows so that future generations could give the orders. They were the bridge over which the modern military marched, a bridge built on the backs of men who were told they weren't good enough to lay the bricks. As we approach the end of this story, we have to look at the landscape of Korea today. The trenches are gone, grown over with grass and trees. The town of Yecheon is a bustling, modern city. The Chosin Reservoir remains a desolate, frozen place in the north. But the memory of what happened there is still alive in the soil. The ghost of the 24th Infantry Regiment is not a restless spirit seeking revenge. It is a sentinel standing guard over the truth. It reminds us that history is not a set of fixed facts. It is a battlefield where narratives clash. For 40 years, the lie won. But the Buffalo Soldiers played the long game. They endured the slander just as they endured the cold. They waited. They kept the faith. And in the end, they won the war for history. But the final victory isn't just about correcting a book. It's about understanding the debt. Every American who sleeps under the blanket of freedom provided by the U.S. military owes a specific, unpaid debt to the men of the 24th. They proved that patriotism isn't about how the country treats you, it's about how you treat the country and the ideals it claims to represent. They loved America more than America loved them. And that is a form of love that is both heartbreaking and humbling. The story of the Deuce Four is almost over, but the echo of their rifles at Yukon is still ringing. It rings every time a soldier stands up against injustice. It rings every time the truth is spoken to power. And it rings right now as we prepare to deliver the final verdict on the regiment that refused to die. As we stand in the third decade of the 21st century, the ranks of the 24th Infantry Regiment have thinned to a precious few. The men who stormed Yechon and ran the gauntlet are now in their 90s. They are the old guard, men whose bodies are failing, but whose memories remain razor sharp, burned into place by the trauma of 1950. For these survivors, the last 20 years have been a race against the clock, a desperate final mission to ensure that when the last man falls, the truth does not die with him. While the 1996 Army report was a watershed moment, it was, in many ways, just the opening salvo of a much longer legal and moral battle. The report admitted the system was racist, yes, but admitting a mistake is not the same as fixing the damage. The wreckage left behind by the bug-out myth wasn't just historical, it was judicial. We must look unflinchingly at the issue of the court-martials. In the panic of the Pusan Perimeter, when white officers were looking for scapegoats to cover their own retreats, the military justice system was weaponized. Dozens of black soldiers were charged with misbehavior before the enemy. These trials were often shams, lasting less than an hour, with evidence provided by officers who weren't even present at the engagement. The consequences were life-altering. A conviction meant a dishonorable discharge. It meant stripping a man of his GI Bill benefits, the very ticket to the middle class that was lifting white veterans out of poverty. It meant he couldn't get a government job. It meant he lost his right to vote in many states. It meant he carried the label of coward and criminal on his permanent record. Imagine the life of a man who fought bravely at Haman, got separated from his unit in the chaos, and was arrested when he stumbled back to friendly lines. He spends the next 50 years working menial jobs, unable to buy a home with a VA loan, unable to tell his children about his service, because the story ends in a cage. He watches as the country celebrates the greatest generation, knowing that he has been exiled from that fraternity by a lie. For these men, the Army's 1996 apology was insufficient. They wanted their names cleared. They wanted their rank restored. They wanted to die as honorable soldiers. The fight to overturn these convictions has been a slow, agonizing trench war fought by lawyers, family members, and historians. It is a fight against a bureaucracy that hates to admit it was wrong in specific cases, even after admitting it was wrong in general. But victories have been won. There have been emotional ceremonies where elderly men, weeping in wheelchairs, were handed updated discharge papers, changing dishonorable to honorable. Families of deceased veterans have received posthumous pardons, finally able to put a flag on their father's grave. These moments of restorative justice are powerful, but they are also infuriatingly rare. They highlight the sheer scale of the theft. How do you compensate a man for 50 years of stolen dignity? You can't. You can only witness it. You can only acknowledge that the American dream was deliberately withheld from the very men who secured it for others. But there is another layer to the legacy of the 24th that transcends the legal struggles. It is the spiritual lineage of the Buffalo Soldier. The 24th Infantry Regiment was one of the 4 original segregated regiments formed after the Civil War, along with the 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. For 81 years, from the Indian Wars on the frontier to the charge up San Juan Hill, from the Philippine jungles to the icy peaks of Korea, the Buffalo Soldiers were the guardians of the American frontier and the American conscience. They were the men who did the hardest work for the least credit. When the 24th was disbanded in 1951, It wasn't just a unit deactivation, it was the death of a dynasty. The 24th was the last link in an unbroken chain of black martial tradition. The men of the Deuce Four were the spiritual grandsons of the cavalrymen who rode against Geronimo. They wore the buffalo patch with a fierce tribal pride. It symbolized endurance. It symbolized a ruggedness that white soldiers couldn't match. The disbandment severed that physical link. The lineage was scattered. Today, there are no Buffalo Soldier units in the active army. The history is kept alive only by the associations and the historians. This loss of identity was a heavy blow. The black soldiers of the 24th felt they were the custodians of a sacred trust, and the army took it away from them. However, in the long view of history, we can see that the spirit of the Buffalo Soldier didn't die. It evolved. It sublimated into the ethos of the modern American soldier. The values of the Buffalo Soldier, resilience, improvisation, loyalty in the face of betrayal, are the very values that the modern army prizes most. The 24th Infantry Regiment, in its final agony in Korea, was the bridge between the old army and the new. They were the martyrs of the old segregated system, dying so that the new integrated system could be born. They proved that you cannot have a separate but equal army. You can only have one army, or no army. As we look at the survivors today, we see men who have achieved a kind of peace. They have outlived their detractors. The racist generals like Edward Almond are largely remembered by historians as incompetent bigots, their reputations stained by their treatment of the 24th. Meanwhile, the names of William Thompson and Cornelius Charlton are engraved in gold. History has a slow, grinding way of flipping the script. The cowards are now heroes. The leaders are now villains. But we must not fall into the trap of a happy ending. The scar tissue remains. There are families in Detroit, in Atlanta, in rural Mississippi, who still have that box in the attic, the one with the medals and the court-martial papers. There is still pain, and there is a warning. The story of the 24th is a warning about what happens when an institution allows prejudice to override performance. It is a case study in how bias creates failure. The white commanders expected the 24th to fail, so they treated them in a way that made failure likely, and when the men succeeded anyway, the commanders lied to protect their own worldview. This is not just history. It is a lesson in organizational psychology that applies to every boardroom, every police department, and every government agency today. The bug-out myth was a virus. It infected the minds of the military for generations, and the only cure was the persistent, stubborn truth-telling of the men who were there. We are now approaching the final benediction of this story. We have one last duty to perform. We need to frame the 24th Infantry Regiment not as a tragedy, but as a triumph of the human will. We need to place them in the pantheon of American warriors, right alongside the Minutemen of the Revolution and the paratroopers of Normandy. They were not unwanted because they were bad. They were unwanted because they were a mirror. They reflected the ugliness of American racism back at the country, and the country couldn't stand the sight. But they didn't break the mirror. They held it up, steady and strong, through the fire and the ice, until the country finally had no choice but to look. In the final block, we will deliver the verdict. We will speak directly to the legacy they leave in our hands. We will summon the spirit of the Deuce Four one last time to remind us that the cost of freedom is always high, but the cost of the truth is even higher. The regiment is gone. The men are leaving us. But the lesson must never be disbanded. Stand by. The final salute is coming. We have walked the ridgelines of Yukon. We have shivered in the frozen darkness of the gauntlet. We have stood witness to the systemic betrayal of the Pusan Perimeter. And now, we arrive at the end of the road. But in history, the end is never really the end. It is merely the point where the past hands the baton to the present. The story of the 24th Infantry Regiment is no longer trapped in the classified files of the Pentagon or the forgotten pages of a slanderous history book. It belongs to us now. It belongs to you. The final verdict on the Deuce 4 is not complex. It does not require a 1,000-page study to understand. It is simple, stark, and undeniable. The 24th Infantry Regiment saved the United States Army in Korea, and the Army repaid them by destroying them. Let us be absolutely clear about the strategic reality of 1950. Without the 24th Infantry holding the line at Yekon, the first ground victory of the war, the North Koreans likely would have turned the flank of the 8th Army. Without the 24th bleeding on Battle Mountain, the Pusan Perimeter might have collapsed, pushing the United Nations into the sea. Without the 24th sacrificing itself in the rearguard of the Kunu-ri Gauntlet, the 2nd Infantry Division might have been totally annihilated. These men were not the weak link of the war effort. They were the steel spine that held the broken body of the Army together while it healed. They bought time with their lives. They paid the bill for American unpreparedness and MacArthur's arrogance. And they did it while listening to their own officers call them cowards. This specific brand of heroism without hope of reward, heroism in the face of active contempt, is the purest form of patriotism in American history. It is easy to fight for a country that treats you like a king. It is agonizing to fight for a country that treats you like a suspect. The men of the 24th loved the idea of America so much that they were willing to die for it, even while the reality of America was spitting in their faces. They were fighting to force the country to become what it said it was on paper. The erasure of the 24th was an attempt to curate a specific version of American history, a version where the military is infallible, where leadership is always noble, and where racism is just a few bad apples rather than a structural doctrine. By recovering this story, we are shattering that curated myth. We are looking at the ugly, scarred, beautiful truth. We are acknowledging that the greatest generation was flawed, deeply and tragically, but that within that flaw, there were men of transcendent grace who carried the burden anyway. The bug-out myth is dead. We have killed it. We have buried it under the weight of the facts. But the ghost of the 24th still has work to do. It stands as a warning to every institution in the modern world. It warns us that when you devalue a group of people based on their identity, you are not just committing a moral crime. You are committing strategic suicide. You are throwing away talent. You are blinding yourself to reality. The Army lost the 24th because it was blind. It couldn't see the warriors standing right in front of it because it was too busy looking at the color of their skin. For the families of the fallen, for the grandchildren of William Thompson and Cornelius Charlton, for the descendants of the men who died in the prisons of the court-martial system, this story is a reclamation of dignity. It is the return of the stolen inheritance. They can now say, without hesitation or shame, my grandfather was a Buffalo soldier. He didn't run. He stood. The regimental colors of the 24th Infantry, once rolled up in disgrace, have been metaphorically unfurled. They fly now in the digital space, in the documentaries, and in the corrected textbooks. The buffalo on their patch is no longer a mark of segregation. It is a badge of honor that signifies the ability to endure the unendurable. But memory is a fragile thing. It requires maintenance. The veterans are leaving us. The last voices who can say, I was at Haman, are falling silent. Soon, there will be no living witnesses. That is why this video exists. That is why you have watched for this long. You are now the witness. You are the custodian of the legacy. When you look at the landscape of the modern world, with its divisions and its anger, remember the lesson of the Deuce 4. Remember that unity is not a slogan. It is a survival tactic. In the foxhole, in the freezing cold, in the face of the enemy, we are all just fragile human beings. trying to make it to the sunrise. The 24th proved that we are stronger together, but only if that togetherness is based on truth and respect. The debt we owe them is infinite. We cannot pay it back, but we can pay it forward. We can ensure that no soldier, no citizen, is ever again told that they are unwanted by the country they serve. We can ensure that the bug-out lie never finds purchase in our soil again. As we close the book on the 24th Infantry Regiment, imagine them one last time, not as old men in wheelchairs, not as victims in a courtroom. Imagine them as they were in the summer of 1950, young, strong, scared, but resolute, dust on their boots, rifles in their hands, standing on a ridgeline in Korea, looking north. They are tired. They are hungry. They know their officers have abandoned them. They know the enemy is coming, but they do not run. They check their ammo. They fix their bayonets. They look at the man to their left and the man to their right, and they hold the line. They held it for us. Now it is our turn to hold the line for them. The 24th Infantry Regiment, the Deuce 4, the last of the Buffalo Soldiers, rejected by their army, erased by their history, but remembered, finally and forever, by the people who know the truth. They were the unwanted, and they were the best of us. This is the end of the story, but the conversation is just beginning. I want to hear from you. If this story made your blood boil, if it made you proud, if it taught you something you never learned in school, hit that like button. It's not just a click. It tells the algorithm that this history matters. Share this video. Send it to a veteran. Send it to a teacher. Send it to anyone who thinks they know the history of the Korean War. Let's make sure the name Deuce 4 rings out in every corner of this country. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We are digging up the stories they tried to bury. We are building a library of the real American history, the blood, the grit, and the glory. Join us. Check the pinned comment for links to the 24th Infantry Regiment Association and resources where you can learn more. To the men of the 24th, we see you, we hear you, and we thank you. Dismissed.